Let's just kick things off with a statement that is, well, it's just as shocking today as it was back in the 18th century. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the biggest names of the Enlightenment, basically argued that the very things we think of as progress, science and art, are actually poisoning our souls.
So today, we're going to unpack this incredible, counterintuitive argument from Rousseau's first discourse. It's basically a philosophical takedown of philosophy itself, and it's an idea that honestly turns everything you and I probably believe about progress completely upside down.
And this immediately lands us on a huge paradox, right? I mean, Rousseau wrote massively influential books, plays, philosophical texts. He was a star of the Enlightenment. So what gives? Was he just a massive hypocrite? Or did he see something that the rest of us have completely missed? That's the puzzle we're going to try and solve.
To start, we really need to understand that for Rousseau, this wasn't just some abstract theory. He saw it as a concrete pattern, something that repeated over and over and over again throughout history. He saw this kind of slithering path of destruction that followed right in the footsteps of so-called progress.
And the pattern he lays out is really fascinating. It goes something like this. Egypt becomes the birthplace of Western philosophy and art, and then it spends the next 2,000 years being ruled by someone else. Greece has its golden age, Plato, Sophocles, all the greats, and it's immediately conquered. Rome then absorbs all that Greek Enlightenment, and then the whole empire collapses. For Rousseau, the pattern was just undeniable. Enlightenment comes along, finds a virtuous people, gives them amazing talents, but it strips away their virtue, leaving them corrupt and ultimately conquered.
So what is it? What exactly about science and art did he think was so corrosive? For Rousseau, it all comes down to a fundamental choice that every single society has to make. And he illustrates this choice perfectly with one of history's greatest rivalries, Sparta versus Athens. The Athenians, they were slick-talking, obsessed with fancy rhetoric and deep philosophy. The Spartans, on the other hand, were all about discipline, sacrifice, and civic virtue. So what did they leave behind? Well, Athens left us beautiful art and timeless philosophy. Sparta? They left us almost nothing, except for heroic stories, models of sacrifice to imitate, and the result? Well, Sparta won the war. For Rousseau, that was no accident.
So the big question is, why? Why does this happen? Rousseau argues it's because artists and scientists, well, they're people first. And as people, they're driven by two incredibly powerful forces, self-interest and pride. And he says that science and art, or Enlightenment, just gets hijacked by these two basic human traits. Okay, let's break down the science part first. Rousseau just completely flips our usual intuition on its head. He says we're all born with this natural sense of pity, but it's reason, it's philosophy, that gives us all the clever excuses we need to not help other people. And on top of that, pride makes intellectuals contrarians. Philosophers invent these wild, absurd systems just to be different, to stand out from the crowd. And all this endless questioning just tears apart the shared beliefs, even if they're false but useful myths that hold a community together. And finally, intellectual work often just becomes a private hobby, a kind of fancy idleness, instead of a real public service.
And then you've got the arts. Rousseau argues that art is basically morally weak. It can only imitate feelings that are already there. It can't actually create new virtues in people. And to be popular, it often has to pander to our worst emotions. But even worse than that, it normalizes deception. An actor's entire job is to appear to be something they're not, and this focus on seeming rather than being infects the whole culture. It leads to luxury, which is all about appearing more valuable than you are, and a kind of fake politeness where nobody dares to be who they really are.
And man, this quote just sums it all up so perfectly. Rousseau's biggest fear was that in gaining a society full of brilliant specialists and talented individuals, we had lost the one thing that actually mattered, a society of virtuous citizens who were truly committed to the common good. Okay, so if Rousseau believed all that, why in the world did he write books and plays himself? This brings us right back to our central puzzle. Was he just a hypocrite, attacking popular ideas to make a name for himself? Now, he does admit that pride played a role, but there's actually a much deeper, much more consistent reason for what he did.
And here it is. This is the key to the whole thing. Rousseau made this absolutely critical distinction between a healthy, virtuous state, like Sparta or his hometown of Geneva, and an already corrupted state, like the Paris he was living in. And what's good for one is basically poison for the other. So get this, his books and his plays, they weren't meant to enlighten the virtuous people, that would just corrupt them. Instead, they were a kind of medicine for an already sick society. In a place like Paris, a play could be a useful distraction to keep idle, corrupt people from doing even worse things. A philosophical book could act like an antidote to fight the bad ideas that were already floating around. He was meeting a corrupt society on its own terms, using its own tools against its own diseases.
So why does any of this matter to us here in the 21st century? Well, because if Rousseau was right, our situation is actually even more dangerous than his was. It leaves us to a truly terrifying modern choice.
See, Rousseau argued that science in his day was mostly pretty useless, a private indulgence. But that has completely, utterly changed. Technology has fused science with world-altering power, power that shapes everything from our economies to how we wage war.
And this changes everything. Back in his day, a virtuous, unenlightened state like Sparta could and did actually defeat the vice-filled, enlightened state of Athens. Power and virtue could be on the same team. But today, a leader is faced with an absolutely impossible choice.
And this is our modern dilemma. To get power, real military and economic power, through science and technology, you need the very things Rousseau said destroy virtue: diversity of thought, contrarianism, individualism. But to cultivate virtue, you need the things that tend to stifle that kind of rapid scientific progress: shared beliefs, social cohesion, sacrifice for the group. So the choice becomes stark. Do you pursue power and knowingly destroy your virtue? Or do you protect your virtue and risk getting conquered by those who don't?
And this leads to a pretty terrifying thought. What if the values that define our modern world, things like individualism, rational inquiry, diversity, what if they didn't win out because they were morally superior? What if they won simply because they happened to be the values necessary to produce more powerful technology, better weapons, and a stronger economy? What if humanity is now in the service of science and not the other way around?
And that leaves us with Rousseau's ultimate question, which feels more relevant today than ever. As we gain more and more power through technology, as we extend our control over the entire world, are we, in that very same process, losing the one thing that makes us human? It's a heavy question, but it's one Rousseau would definitely want us to wrestle with.